Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasul.
Yes, Khalid's murder helped topple Mubarak, but the old regime is still very much alive.
If it was not for the case of Khalid Said, they may never have been able to be given the chance to contest these elections.
The answer is obvious, the cell phone. I mean, it's the quickest, fastest way to get to the people who need it.
$4 million in about 24 hours.
Nick and I wanted to galvanize people into action because we know it takes a world to bring about this change.
We started something, a community.
I have friends that have been living in this conflict their entire life. Fight for that, because that is what is going to change this world, and that is what defines us.
We got creative, and we got loud.
It's not over! It's not over!
Good morning and welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many old friends here. And for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Sheldon Himelfarb, and I manage USIP's Center of Innovation on Media, Conflict, and Peacebuilding. This is just a terrific turnout. We've got a full house across the day, and I guess I really shouldn't be surprised. These campaigns that we're going to be talking about, the images that you just saw captured in that video, they have captivated the hearts of millions. They've come into our homes, they've shifted our mindset, they've motivated us into action, and most importantly, they've actually achieved results. We know that because of the media attention that Kony 2012 video drummed up, as controversial as it was, that both the African Union and the US Congress took action. We know the Red Cross crowdsourced tens of millions of dollars in disaster relief money in record time using a cell phone-based texting campaign. We know that the Facebook campaigns, Are All Khaled Said, and A Million Voices Against the FARC in Colombia, both spurred massive street demonstrations that ultimately rocked the political status quo in those countries. And we know that the Half the Sky multimedia campaign has helped to make women and girls issues like sex trafficking and maternal mortality a dinner table conversation in many of our homes. But what we don't know very much about is how they did it, which is why we're here today. Hundreds, if not thousands, of similar mobilization campaigns get started in social media every day. I'm sure you see them on your Facebook news feeds. And nearly all of them fail to achieve anything like the success that we've seen here. Why did these movements that we're going to talk about today succeed where so many others have not? What are the active ingredients of success? And what is the role of government? These are the kinds of questions we want to ask today. We want to ask them of the very activists who led these movements so that tomorrow we may be better prepared to mobilize local, national, even global networks of collaboration and peace building. But before we dig into these topics, just a little bit of housekeeping very quickly. You all have agendas in the folders that you've picked up outside, so you can see it's going to be a very rich and full day. We know how hard it is for you to get time out of your offices, let alone a full day like this. So if there's anything we can do to make it more productive, please let the USIP staff, the ITVS staff know. Some of you know that I used to say that we wanted a day you spend in a meeting with us to be at least as productive as a day that you would spend in your own offices. But then many people came up to me and said, Sheldon, that's really not that high a bar to be setting for USIP. So we'll try to exceed that bar, and don't hesitate to ask, as I said, the many staffers around here for help in doing so. This is the 4th meeting in the Media's Global Diplomat series that USIP and ITVS, the independent television service, began in 2009. And from the beginning, we have tried to practice what we preach by not only discussing new opportunities in media and information technology to improve public diplomacy and international bridge building for peace, but actually modeling how to use these new tools and platforms in our meetings. Today, we're going to continue that effort by doubling down on truly involving our global audience in this meeting with the help of a dedicated online host you see there, Sreenivasan from PBS NewsHour, who in a moment is going to explain exactly what we're doing to engage that online audience. In the past, we've taken questions from our online audience, but in this meeting, we're pushing much harder to actually involve them, engage them in what's going on here. So it's a bit of an experiment, mind you. I hope you'll give us a little bit of slack, but one we hope you'll agree is worthwhile in sort of setting the bar for future global engagement around meetings we have here in Washington, D.C. And the second way that this meeting is different from earlier ones we've done is in the training workshops that we are shooting for, we will be holding this afternoon. Again, the purpose of this meeting is not simply to talk about past campaigns and successes for social change, but to help enable future campaigns. So you can still sign up for those hands-on workshops. There'll be a registration desk going all day out there. I see folks waiting at the top. There are seats down here. Feel free to come on down. I know we're going to have a packed house, so you can move on down here to some of the seats in the front. USIP is a best practice organization. Sometimes I think we're taking our best practices from the airline industry when it comes to seating protocol. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't conclude by saying a word about our partner, ITVS, the independent television service. This series continues not only because ITVS is a great collaborator, but also because we, USIP, continue to learn so much from them about how to use media for global outreach and peace building. They are real pioneers in this. I know there's information about ITVS in your brochures, and I urge you to take a look at it. They are real pioneers in this, and it has to do with the visionary leadership of two people in particular, Tamara Gould, who is you will hear from a little later on in the day, who's here in the front row, and Sally Jo Fifer, who you will hear from in a few moments here to kick the meeting off. So thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Sally Jo, for that leadership across these years. And speaking of great leaders, it is a real honor and pleasure to turn the mic over to USIP's new Executive Vice President, Kristin Lord. As many of you know, Kristin has been a thought leader in Washington for a long time, and especially on public diplomacy issues. So we are really lucky that she would be able to join us here this morning. Kristin.
Thank you, Sheldon. Good morning and welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today for this 4th meeting in the Media and Global Diplomat series. I was actually at the first one of these meetings in 2009. I was just an interested observer, and like many of you here today, a friend of Sheldon, FOS, as we call it. And so it's a particular pleasure for me to join you here today for the 4th one in this series. I am especially pleased to be doing this as one of USIP's newest employees, and so I can tell you with some authority after a month here that the restrooms are right over there behind you. On behalf of all of us here at the Institute today, I want to begin by extending thanks to the many people and organizations who have helped make this event possible. Of course, we have Frank Sesno, our moderator today, and my longtime GW colleague and co-conspirator. We have our online host, Sreenivasan, who will be helping us today, and our many outstanding panelists and experts. I'm sure you've been as impressed as I am with the lineup we have. I'm also grateful for the wonderful partnership of the Independent Television Service, or ITVS, over the last 4 years. And it's produced so many of these important summits, and they just do terrific work. Of course, I'd like to thank our own team here, which has been a real leader in terms of examining the transformative role of media and technology on global politics, conflict resolution, and peace. And finally, I want to thank those in our audience, both those physically here and the folks around the world, many of whom can't be here with us in the audience, but they do have the luxury of watching in their pajamas. So that is, I hope, makes up for some of it. Of course, the very fact that we're here in Washington meeting while engaging around the world in real time on a nonprofit budget is really quite remarkable. And it's truly incredible in this new world of global media and social media, which is so much of our daily lives that we almost take for granted that we can do this. But it's really quite incredible indeed. And it's, of course, precisely why we've come together today to talk about this transformative impact. In his first speech as Secretary of State, our new neighbor, John Kerry, who works just around the block there, talked about the possibility of young people around the world working together as a cohort. And they can do this because of these technologies that connect them in unprecedented ways, but also the real embrace of these technologies. He said we need to help them, and all of us need to learn too, how to use these technologies in a positive way. And those of us here at the Institute certainly agree with this. We need to figure out how to use these technologies more effectively to help us promote our core mission, which is to prevent violent international conflict and to promote peace and prosperity around the world. So I'm looking forward to hearing the advice today of this distinguished group of experts that's been assembled by our Center of Innovation for Media and our partners at ITVS. And I'd like to pass the microphone now to Sally Jo Fifer, the president and CEO of ITVS, and also just our terrific partner in this effort. So thanks very much, Sally Jo.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for that great and kind introduction. And thanks to our partners at USIP, Jim Marshall, Sheldon Himelfarb, and a great technical team. As you've heard, this is the fourth Media as Global Diplomat Summit that ITVS and USIP have done together. And ITVS doesn't get to a fourth date that often. I think we might be going steady. Hats off, of course, to Tamara Gould, who, along with Sheldon, had the gleam in their eye for this summit, and you'll hear from later today. Beatrice Castillo, Steve Goldblum, Sarah Boxer have been terrific ITVS staff working on the program. I also want to thank Doris Duke Foundation, especially for their support of this event and for their broader support of a program we have called Diverse Muslim Voices. We're also very lucky to have a fantastic long-running partner in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting under the leadership of Patricia Harrison, President CEO there. ITVS has grown to be the largest producer of independent documentaries for public broadcasting. And since 2005, we've taken many of these films abroad, and just last year forged a new partnership with Ford Foundation and USAID to use documentaries to lift up women and girls' voices around the world. 4 years ago, I stood up here and told you that independent voices are important because they're authentic, because they try for those ground truths, because they share the human experience behind the headlines, and that's still true. 4 years ago, though, we talked a lot about how overwhelmed we were by the information glut. We're still complaining about that, of course. But we take for granted a new media reality where 2.4 billion minds are virtually connected in things like big data. Where do independent voices fit into all of that? Well, for starters, of course, we all know that we depend on stories to make sense of the world. But the danger has been that the more information we process, the more our minds look for quick patterns, easy answers, stereotypes that conform to what we already believe. But In fact, just yesterday, each one of us was confronted with more information to process than the average person in the 15th century that they had in their whole lifetime. So was there something that surprised you? Was there a voice that you hadn't heard from? Was there a story that stopped the racing mind, changed you? Well, these kinds of stories and the people who tell them, the ones that make us stop, aren't just storytellers, they're change makers. They're revolutionaries, they're peacemakers. Films like Half the Sky and 10 by 10 are not just films, they're part of a movement that lifts women and girls up everywhere. And sometimes independent media is not just a refreshing alternative, it's an alternative to silence. So technologies kick down that door between action and story, but which stories and which action? The voices and platforms that we're going to talk about today represent the great strengths of independent voices singly and together. And it's on this path that USIP and ITVS fell into step together, because it's also a path to facing our differences and resolving our conflicts. So do we have the tools and the skills and the will to deal with this new connected world? Well, we're glad we're on this fourth day together, and we hope that we can figure it out today with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally Jo. Thank you, Kristin. We are going to move right along now, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to our online correspondent, Sreenivasan, who's going to tell us about how he's going to try to bring some of this meeting directly to the online audience and bring them to us in ways we have never tried before, to be honest. And just before doing that, I also want to acknowledge there's a couple of folks that have been really gracious in helping us get here. That opening video you saw was from Getzel's Gordon Productions. They really did a wonderful job in a very short amount of time. And Harry's going to be talking about Zoom as well, another partner in this day-long experience.
So just to pull this circle tighter, there've already been a few people on Twitter asking whether that video is available or whether it'll be available online for them afterwards. Do you have an answer for that?
And the answer is we will post it.
There you go. So that's part of what I'm doing. No disrespect to the audience in the cheap seats, but my audience is out there. So to the folks in the live stream, thanks for joining us. I'd just like to ask you to do a few things. One is if you've got a question or a comment, just like the one that we just asked of Sheldon, go ahead and tweet it out. You can use the hashtag Global Diplomat. I'm watching that. Or you can just write to me at Hari, which is at H-A-R-I. I'll try to get those questions into the conversation. Frank Sesno is going to be moderating some amazing panelists, and so we're going to try to find ways to incorporate the conversation that's happening outside the room into this room as well. And then we should also tell you that this is also a virtual networking opportunity. If you care about this space, here's an opportunity for you to see all these other people that are also having this conversation alongside. Reach out, make some friends. And in the spirit of sharing, I ask that you try to share this with one person that's out there that you think might be interested in this, because we know that personal appeals are far more important and interesting and engaging, and we'll probably find that out to be the case through these major campaigns as well. So a couple of quick thank yous to Tech Change. They're going to be including today's webcast in their online courses on technology for conflict management. So not only do we have these folks in the room, the folks that are watching on a live stream, we also have students that are engaged in Afghanistan, Sudan, Nepal, Egypt, and other places. And one of the folks from 60-Second Film Festival, Abrar Hassan, I've already sort of responded to him on Twitter as well. He's also part of this conversation. And also a thank you to the folks at Zoom who are doing all the data visualizations and controlling the stuff that you see on the screen behind me, and then sometimes the screen up there as well. Sheldon?
Thank you, Hari. Wow, this is so new for us. I just want to make sure people don't leave to go home and watch Hari on their webcam. So it's now time for our first keynote speaker, and it is really, really a pleasure for me to introduce him. Someone who I've known a long time and who has really been at the forefront of the transformations in the use of media, both in the civil society world as well as in the U.S. government. Alec Ross, as Senior Advisor for Innovation at the State Department, he has truly walked the talk and driven change at every level in the organization when it comes to technology. Not only has he helped to define the concept of 21st century statecraft. Alec has helped America apply it in concrete terms in our embassies around the globe. And in the process, for his work, he's also been named one of foreignpolicy.com's top global thinkers, top 100 global thinkers, and I'm not surprised at all. So, thank you for joining us, Alec. We really do look forward to hearing your perspective.
Great, thank you. All right, cue that first slide. Morning, everybody. It's a lot of fun to be here this morning. Most of today, as I look at the schedule, is going to be principally rooted in analyzing how media, how social media have either successfully or unsuccessfully propelled movements in recent years. And what I wanted to do just during some very, very brief remarks was actually make some predictions, look around the corner a little bit. I'm now winding up in sort of the very, very final stretch of my time in government. And when I came in 4 years ago, I made a series of predictions, which today would seem fairly obvious, but which 4 years ago were considered really radical. You know, somebody described me as bringing punk rock to America's foreign policy. And now punk rock is completely mainstreamed. And what I wanted to do was reflect just very briefly on some of what those things were that I thought were going to happen 4 years ago and how they did or did not prove true, but then take most of this time to talk about what I actually think is going to most impact movement making as it intersects with media and social media and with connection technologies in the future. The first thing is, if there is one thing that I've learned in government over the past 4 years, is that there's a massive shift in geopolitical power that's taken place. Now, most people who talk about shifts in geopolitical power do so on a geographic basis. The presumed shift of power from west to east, from Europe and the United States to Asia, or from the global north to the global south. Now, whether that is true or not, or the degree to which that is true, I will leave to others to discuss. But what I do know is that in nearly all 196 countries on planet Earth, there has been a noticeable shift in power, and that shift in power is from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens. There's been a noticeable shift in power from hierarchies, like large media companies, like governments, to citizens and networks of citizens, and connection technologies, web, mobile, social, and other such things, have been facilitators in that shifting power. And a lot of what we can say with the benefit of some retrospection now is that media, and social media specifically, have played an interesting and meaningful role in these power shifts in a couple distinct ways. First, they accelerate movement making. So movements that would have once taken years to develop, largely done by people with strong ties between them, now can be done much more quickly through the relatively open platforms that are social media. Secondly, it's a cliche, but a cliche for good reason, to say that information is power. And now the access to information, enriched information environments, are so much more easily arrived at as we've gone from environments, particularly in the developing world, from information scarcity to information abundance. We've gone from environments where people principally get their information from the one newspaper they read in the morning, the one state-controlled TV news broadcast they watched at night, maybe the Imam, to people getting their information from dozens, if not hundreds of sources repeatedly throughout the day. And then lastly, the relatively leaderless nature of these networks of these movements that networks help support. You know, it's interesting, if you think both domestically and abroad about the major movements that have had social media at their core, whether it was the SOPA and PIPA movements here, whether it was certain of the revolutions in the Maghreb, there's nobody's face you're going to put on a T-shirt from any of those movements. There's no Václav Havel, there was no Lech Walesa, there was no Nelson Mandela, and there was no one individual propelling those movements. Rather, the leadership structures looked more like the internet itself, more like a web than like a pyramid. And this is both good and bad. It means that the movements are more citizen-centered than rooted in a cult of personality. But those of us who work in my building are also contending with the negative aspects of that, which is absent a Nelson Mandela, absent an institution and movement like, say, the Solidarity Movement from Poland, there are no individuals or institutions around whom an entire country will come together. And so the relative leaderless or nodal nature of the leadership structures, as facilitated by social media and other things, can help in a way make revolutions easier, but make governance much harder. And I think we can definitively assert now, with a couple years of retrospection, that these three things are true. They accelerate movement making, they enrich the information environments, and the leadership structures are more networked leadership or nodal leadership or leaderless than hierarchical, rooted in a cult of personality. Now, what I want to do for the next couple of minutes is sort of look around the corner and talk about what I think the future is going to bring in terms of the intersection of connection technologies and movement making. First, there's been an enormous amount of attention, particularly over the last couple of weeks, as more information has come to public light about the increasing level of conflict in the cyber domain. There have been some studies published, both from inside government, which have been declassified, as well as from outside of government, which show the degree to which there is real state-to-state conflict in the cyber domain. 4 years ago, there was interesting asymmetry. It was largely citizens who were heavily engaged in the internet for political purposes, and the state had a far less forward-leaning role. We then went from that position of asymmetry to the network, so to speak, becoming increasingly competitive. And now I think that the best description of these networks for political purposes is no longer merely competitive, but conflict-ridden. And a lot of what I think is going to happen now in terms of political movement making is the kind of cyber conflict that we've seen principally rooted in conflicts from state to state or state to corporation, where a state or a state-sponsored entity tries to extract intellectual property or other such things from a corporation. What I increasingly think is that the ability to weaponize code, the ability to essentially almost buy off-the-shelf malware, is going to get sufficiently powerful and cheap that what we're increasingly going to see are individuals and movements targeted for cyber attack or for sort of some kind of, let's call it a cyber intrusion, to the degree to which principally the people on the receiving end of those attacks have been states or large corporations. Now, there have been some examples of this. So Ben Ali, in December of 2010, for example, cyber attacked all of the citizens of Tunisia who were on Facebook. They were cyber attacking their own citizens' Facebook accounts to try to figure out who the leaders were of this very new revolution in their country. And what they came to learn was, number one, Facebook had a more sophisticated cyber operation than they did, so they were able to identify and stop the attack. But secondly, they learned the point that I made earlier, that there wasn't like a guy or a handful of guys, behind the cyber curtain manipulating this movement. That when in fact, if you were going to cyber attack 1.4 million of your citizens, you were far more likely to find 1.4 million people who were having something to do with the political movement in your country than, the one person making revolution. And what I see, though, is that if you think about sort of the laws of computing, Moore's law and other such things, what you see is processing power devolving to the individual that would have once been reserved for the state or for a large corporation. And I think the weaponization of code is just around the corner, where anybody with a credit card essentially could buy a cyber attack against somebody. And so I think a lot of what we've seen that has historically been rooted in state conflict is going to increasingly be rooted in individual or small organizational conflict. And I think that that has a lot of implications for political movement making. Number two, I spoke earlier about the shifts in geopolitical power from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens. Shifting nature of power. And now anybody who understands power understands that power is never given away willingly, okay? And even the most unenlightened states, even the most unenlightened leaders can now, if you have two eyes that are capable of opening, you're capable of seeing how your citizens now have the ability to communicate, to collaborate, to organize in ways that weren't possible as recently as 5 years ago. And for those states or those hierarchies who see the degradation of their power, what they're now trying to do is take any measure to keep power, to keep their hands on it. And one of the results of this is a significant increase in the level of investment in surveillance and surveillance technologies. So what would have been unimaginable levels of surveillance 5 years ago, I think is increasingly mainstream today. And in part, this is something that really began, some people point to the Arab Spring. Truthfully, it began earlier with the Green Movement in Iran in June of 2009. As people, particularly people at the top of dictatorships, view the cyber domain as something that poses a threat to their power, one of the most obvious things that they can do about it is leverage the increasing sophistication and increasing power of network technologies to try to get more information about their own people, to keep a closer eye on their own people. And the net result of that is billions, if not tens of billions of dollars going in to develop and deploy the next generation of surveillance technologies. So what's interesting is as recent as 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, it was possible to build a movement over social media. And part of why people did build movements over social media was that the Mukhabarat, the state police and others were watching the square. They were watching the cafes. They were watching the university classrooms, but they weren't sophisticated about watching Facebook or other social networking services. Those days are long gone. And so it's no longer possible to hide in the same way it was possible as recently as 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It's no longer possible to hide in these spaces, in part because states are willing to invest significant resources into untangling what's happening in the social media sphere. The third thing I think is going to be that's going to be a partial response to all of this is activists tend to be survivors, and they tend to be early adopters of technologies or of techniques that will allow them to stay safe as they do things that work against the interests of the state. And one of the things that I predict we're going to see a significant rise of over the next year, 18 months, 2 years, are darknets. For those of you who don't know, darknets are essentially encrypted communications channels that allow for authenticated users to communicate with one another in a way that frankly operates separate from the indexable web. It either lives separate from an existing telecommunications network or in what is largely considered to be a secure channel like the chat function within a multiplayer online gaming system. But what I see and what I think is going to really increase over the next year, 18 months, 2 years is as people become increasingly aware of the degree to which their movements are being watched, as they become increasingly fluent in the level of cyber conflict that is increasing, I think that people are going to go to those parts of the internet where they simply cannot be found. And so I predict that the amount of dark web or deep web traffic that's essentially non-indexable or which is very difficult to spider is going to absolutely shoot up over the very short term. And unfortunately, there are not necessarily the kinds of market incentives to develop safe tools in this space that there are to develop in, say, the surveillance realm, which is why it's increasingly important for institutions like the State Department to invest heavily in technologies that are really rooted in allowing people to exercise their universal rights as opposed to empowering the state to use these same technologies to throttle back people's rights. Now, having said all of this, and I know this is a bit dark, you can see I see too much in these jobs, almost. I do believe that the end result of this is the increasing empowerment of citizens and networks of citizens at the expense of the state. What I believe, though, is that it's not going to be frictionless. As power devolves to citizens and networks of citizens, I think what you're going to see is a lot of fighting back from central authorities. But I think they're fighting back against the tide of history. And to try to control that which is inherently uncontrollable, or to try to throttle back the will of your citizens and citizens who have access to powerful tools and a sophistication about how to use those tools, you're really swimming against the tide of history. And so part of what I'm actually fairly optimistic about is I do see a number of governments that historically have been anti-democratic moving in a more democratic direction. So if you think about, for example, certain of those countries in the Middle East, in the Maghreb, in the Levant, that have not experienced revolution recently, even though they were particularly vulnerable to it perhaps at the outset of the Arab Spring, part of it is because they actually loosened the reins a little bit. They allowed for more democratic participation. They gave the space, the outlet, so that the young people who are frustrated about high levels of corruption, the lack of upward economic mobility, the lack of democratic participation, I think that you can look to certain governments as having made the right response. You know, there's a reason why there's a revolution taking place in Syria right now and not in Jordan. There's a reason why there was a revolution in Libya and not in Morocco. So I think that one of the key lessons, particularly as you think about this outside of the context of the Middle East, is to think, when you think about Asia and Africa, other parts of the world that are becoming hyper-networked themselves, I do think that there are very powerful lessons for the leaders of those countries to learn as movements take root in those countries that are invariably about wanting more upward economic mobility, wanting more democratic participation, or other such things. So with that, I'll conclude. I apologize for having to scoot out now. I have a punishing schedule today. I wish I could participate all day today, but cannot. But I will, to the extent possible, follow things online. And I want to thank USIP for inviting me today, and thank you.
Well, that is just a great way to get us started, because we're going to hear from activists on this next panel who really have experienced firsthand that tension between, state surveillance and activist ingenuity that Alec was talking about. We will, throughout the day, I should say, have plenty of opportunities for Q&A from the audience, both here in the room and online. So let me ask you to lean in, be making a note of questions you want to ask the panelists going forward. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Frank Sesno. Frank, you might come up here now. Frank is not just a veteran journalist, he is a director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at GW University, as you heard earlier, and an Emmy award-winning journalist. But most importantly, he is a combination of that on-the-ground journalist and public intellectual who can help us understand the kinds of profound changes in the media world that we have been experiencing for the last couple of decades. And he's going to be moderating the conversation with some extremely talented groups of people. I will leave it to Frank to introduce our panelists, but first, join me in welcoming Frank Sesno as our moderator.
I'll start from the podium. Thank you very much, Sheldon, and thank you to all of you in the room and in the online audience for joining this conversation today. To Kristin, welcome, congratulations. I'm so delighted to see you here. Now you really will have your hands-on changing the world, and I know that's something that's been a lifelong aspiration of yours, and you're going to make just and are making such a great contribution. Sally, it's great to be here with ITVS, which as someone who's made documentaries, loves documentaries, teaches documentaries, what I say to my students and what I said to myself as I did this is the medium that has the power to make people laugh, make people cry. We are all storytellers, and this is the most amazing, powerful form of storytelling there can be, now delivered and now driven by so many new technologies literally around the world, and that's some of what we'll discuss. A couple of things that already struck me in the conversation today and that we'll be exploring here, and I really look forward to doing that. In the introductory video, we got creative and we got loud. We got creative and we got loud. And then there was that magic that took it to some other place. What is that magic? How does it happen? How is it the marriage of content and delivery vehicle and personality, and as Alec pointed out, this new phenomenon, a relatively new phenomenon, often a leaderless or largely leaderless revolution. I remember interviewing Václav Havel. I had a great privilege to do that in the mid-90s, and I asked him, what was the magic of your revolution, of the Velvet Revolution? And he said, it was the fax machine. Because that was our technology, that was our way to move around authorities and to galvanize people without necessarily being listened to in the most direct ways until they learned how to manage eavesdropping onto fax transmissions. What we'll be doing here today is taking on some of these issues. When Wael Ghanem saw a picture of Khaled Said after he was beaten to death by the Egyptian police, he shared that photo, as you will recall, on Facebook. And he wrote, "Today they killed Khaled. If I don't act for his sake tomorrow, they will kill me." And he named the page, and you know it, you remember it. We Are All Khaled Said. And in a few days, it had thousands of members. A young Colombian named Oscar Morales was so frustrated with the FARC's intimidation and the attacks of Colombian citizens over decades, that he created 1 Million Voices Against the FARC, a Facebook page, which in its way attracted people very quickly, 100,000 followers within the first week, and ultimately led to millions of people marching in 104 cities. This was not with a budget of millions or billions of dollars. This was not with some fancy public relations firm helping him figure out how to connect. How did these online social network campaigns morph into offline social movements? Why do these social media campaigns succeed in mobilizing millions of people to take to the streets when so many other campaigns are launched every day and do not? What are these active ingredients of success? And what is, as we were talking a little bit just a moment ago, what is the X factor? Let me introduce the panelists to you, and I'm very much looking forward to their conversation, to the online conversation, and Hari and I will talk about that in just a minute, and to the conversation that you will join in here in the room. Nadine Wahab is the International Advocacy Officer of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. She was the Deputy Campaign Manager for Mohammed al-Baradei's presidential campaign before and during the Egyptian Revolution. She was an administrator on the Kolina Khaled Said Facebook page. Please join me in welcoming Nadine Wahab. And you're just off the plane from Cairo, you told me, right?
Well, last night, yes.
Last night, that's what I mean, yes. So a good night's sleep, and off we go. Oscar Morales is a Colombian engineer and the founder of 1 Million Voices Against the FARC. That's the movement that successfully used Facebook to organize a 12 million person protest on February 4th, 2008. He currently works as a social media planner at Havas Worldwide Colombia, a global marketing firm. Next up, Abderrahim Foukara, who's the U.S. Bureau Chief for Al Jazeera satellite channel, host of its weekly flagship program, In Washington, on U.S. affairs, how they impact the Arab region. He is a tremendous journalist, and he's in hiring mode. So if anybody is looking to work for Al Jazeera, I'm understanding, Abderrahim, that you can help them, yes? Resumes welcome.
Don't call me, I'll call you.
So welcome. Adel Iskandar is a scholar of Arab media and communication. He's the author and editor of several works, including Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism. He currently teaches at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and at the Communication, Culture, and Technology program at Georgetown University. Welcome. And finally, Matt Perault is the head of policy development at Facebook, where he manages the company's strategy on global policy issues. Prior to joining Facebook, Matt was counsel at the Congressional Oversight Panel. So Matt, man with the power from Facebook, thank you very much. And now, before I take my seat here, Hari and I have talked about this, and what we're going to try to do is, Hari is sort of shadow panelist here as well. So for those of you who are listening, watching, participating online, please share your questions and your observations with Hari. And periodically, I will turn to Hari and ask Hari to tell us what's happening online, what seems to be developing, and then we will also incorporate some of the questions online as well. We've got some interesting multimedia engagement for you as well as we go. And so, Nadine, let me start with you. And let me put the Facebook page up that we're talking about. You were administrator for this Facebook page. We were All Khaled Said. You worked with Wael Ghonim, who could not join us today, in setting up the page, which sparked so many of these protests. So tell us about the page, sort of what thoughts went into it as you started to create it. Did you have any idea that this spark was going to touch to the fuel and explode in popular protests like this?
Well, I mean, my initial contact with the page was after he had set it up, actually, a couple days after. And having seen the picture of Khaled Said's kind of going around the internet, I was working with him on something else completely, and I was G-chatting, and I said, can you imagine this? Oh my God, we have to do something. He sort of, I guess an online giggle would be the best way to do it. I said, look at this page, some of them are really wonderful. You got a little online giggle. I'm the one who set this up. In short. And at this point, I was like, oh my God, I have to join, I have to help. So I think within 4 days of setting up the page, we had started working on it. One of the things that initially, I think for me, was it is an issue, a catalyst that isn't necessarily online. It isn't all of a sudden I thought I have to work on a Facebook page so I can do X. This is beyond comprehension. This is something I cannot sit for. What are available to me? Social media. I was living in the US. This is the best way I can help. I had worked in media, so reaching out to the media, making sure the story is reaching out. This was the tool that was available to us.
But did you go into this saying, I have to help, and we will go viral, and I will make this viral, or was it, I just have to help and get it out there?
There's nothing else you can do. Having sort of seen the oppression happening in Egypt, you look for any way to be able to get out, any way to be able to engage, and to be able to stop such atrocities. Social media is an easy access for us. So no, I had no idea it would go viral. When we had first started doing the protests offline, we were doing silent protests on the Nile, on the Corniche on the Nile, on the boardwalk on the Nile in Alexandria. And I remember reaching out to all media points and saying, you guys, this is big. There's, 3,000 people. This was huge for us.
When you say reaching out to all media points, who was that?
Everyone. I worked as a press secretary, so I was reaching out to CNN. I was
traditional media.
Traditional media, trying to get them to see how amazing this page was and how exciting that it had moved from the 500-person protest to a couple thousand people standing on the corniche and finding a way to stand up to, for example, the emergency law. You stood a meter apart. You wore in black. You didn't speak. So you didn't break the law, but you engaged in, with silence, in being able to stand up to voice your concern or opinion against something. And no one was listening.
How and when did this start to go viral?
I would say for me, it was probably the first time we took it offline. I don't think people really started noticing what was happening online unless you were online. And that's interesting because the usual suspects started working. But then when we took it and made it an offline movement, and with the first, the flash mob, people standing up, people started noticing. So what are you doing here? People would then go to the page. So we started from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand to, a couple of weeks later, Dr. Baradei was going down. So this snowballed when we took it offline and the offline community started noticing what we were doing online. I think sticking to the online community only limits your access. You need to bounce back and forth and to be able to engage the offline community to have effective change.
So in a sense, what you're doing is you're showing the offline community what you're doing online, which is creating a cycle,
yes,
right? So one encourages. Now, we have pictures. Here's some of the pictures from the protests themselves. And what a lot of the pictures from the protests showed was people holding up pictures of the Facebook page. So talk about that role and how that was creating this cycle.
One of the few things that the Are Khaled Said Facebook page was its anonymity. And one of the strongest things was no one knew who Khaled Said was. No one knew who Wa'il Ghanem was. And because of this, how scared we were for security, I actually referred to him in a lot of my conversations as Khaled Said. So when I was talking about the admin of the Khaled Said page, I would never use his name because we had started getting threats early on. From the
government?
Well, we don't know. They're just viral. They're internet threats. So it was to the Gmail account, to the Facebook page. And so the symbol of Kulina Khaled Said is more important than the Facebook page. And because the Facebook page tapped into that, it became the mechanism for people to engage. The anonymity meant they owned it. It wasn't mine, it wasn't Wa'il's. In fact, when he came out, a lot of the early supporters of the Facebook page had a little bit difficulty dealing with him because he became the symbol of that Facebook page, but they really felt ownership for the page. And one of the things that Wa'il Ghanem really did well was give them ownership. Everything that was said from the initial protest to every sort of offline action, he did it through consensus building, through asking the question, through polling. And so that ownership meant that, yes, they went into the streets and held up the placards with Facebook or Kulina Khaled Said because they own that page, they own the movement.
What started happening when people went into the streets and held up the signs for the Facebook page? Did that drive dramatic additional traffic?
Yes.
Because then that became part of this cycle.
Yes. An interesting other point with the Kulina Khaled Said page is Wa'il Ghanem was really good, just as he had a point of contact outside the country. I was one of the security measures. So I was the admin who he would log in through so that they couldn't find who the specific admin was. He had a really good work and, as Alec had mentioned earlier, a really good job of networking. And so while Kulina Khaled Said was sort of the public platform, it was the stage for which everyone spoke, a lot of the work was happening either on closed pages, on small groups, or on other pages. So he understood his audience very, very well and spoke to them, but a lot of the other stuff was happening on other pages, and he would link it through them, so not ignoring everyone else.
Alec talked about leaderless revolutions. Would you consider this leaderless?
Yes.
You would?
Yes.
Explain.
Because just as much as the Kulina Khaled Said page got a lot of attention and Wa'il Ghanem gets a lot of attention, there are a lot of small pages who all liked the Kulina Khaled Said and used that as a mechanism to get the information and share the information around, but they linked a lot of smaller networks. And those smaller networks were actually, for me, more important than the larger network, other than connecting.
And last question before I move on to Oscar. Did you have a deliberate strategy to link to those other networks, knowing that they would bring numbers of people themselves?
Deliberate I think it's a natural strategy. It's as you would do organizing offline. When you're doing organizing, you split things into your access points and start engaging with them. So I think deliberate, anyone who lives both on and offline would naturally do that. I think when you're thinking strategy-wise, you may forget to use your offline techniques online because you're still dealing with people. You're not dealing with bots or computer entities standing alone.
Ari, before I move on to Oscar, observations from the online community up till now and some of the conversation through social media about this social media?
Yeah, I think a lot of a couple of the questions that I've seen is how do you make sure that the idea stays consistent from transferring to online to offline, right? So it's a little bit about messaging as well. So if you wanted to try to get something across to your fans of this page, how do you make sure that the message is not sort of hijacked in the middle, or it's like a game of telephone that spreads from one person to another, but at some point your message has been diluted?
I think keep it simple, keep it short, but accept the fact that you don't own the message. Khaled Said was not owned by the Facebook page. It was a feeling, and we just amplified it. So you find that message that resonates with people and just give it as platform, because then people really feel it and will automatically repeat it. But simple and short, I think if you're worried about having it switched or hijacked.
Simple and short. Okay, Oscar, to you. Take a look at some photos to show the scale of the crowds. I mean, that is where?
This is Medellin, the second largest city of Colombia, and in the main plaza, it's the representation of what was happening in every single capital of every province of Colombia.
And how many people were in Medellin?
Just in Medellin alone, we had 1 million in one single crowd.
1 million in one crowd?
One crowd.
This was when? Remind people when this took place?
This is the one, this is the place, and people actually in the picture, we couldn't, the one that took the picture said that there were 10 blocks around that crowd because they didn't fit. So that's how they could fit there using like a big, huge plaza.
So bring people in the room and online into your campaign, what you did, what sparked it, how you drove to this, which is unbelievable.
Yes, and I want to point out about the X factors of something that I have found in many other movements. We had our genesis, and we have two things, a triggerer and fuel. Triggerer, it's always the face of victim. It's the same that I saw in Tunisia when this Mohamed Bouazizi in this city that was
the spark.
He sparked that Tunisian mobilization that ended in Ben Ali flying out. And then it moved to Egypt. I don't know if you were aware that just like 10 to 15 days before Egyptian spring, Tunisia was the one who started it. And there was a triggerer, the face of the victim. So did you, and then we had one, Emmanuel. It was only a 4-year-old boy, born in captivity.
A 4-year-old boy born in captivity.
Born in captivity because his mother had been kidnapped in 2002, never released. And then she was raped, pregnant, kid born, and the kid was about to die. So there was a journalist that went inside the jungle to cover that story.
He was about to die, why?
Because of starvation and diseases and malaria and tuberculosis and mosquito bites. And he also had a broken shoulder during birth. And we had this information because of a journalist that had access to that story and brought it back to us. And we knew who this was. We had the picture of that kid. So that kid was finally dumped in a clinic, almost death. And when the president of Colombia actually stopped on national TV, he stopped the programming on January 1st, 2008, to say that the kid had been found and that they were crying the release of the mother. I mean, the authorities were asking for the release of the mother because the kid couldn't be alone. Of course, FARC denied, and that was the single story that actually raised us.
Now, you developed a Facebook.
Broke us. It broke us. It broke us.
And was that the focus of the Facebook page? That was the right. So talk about
your
Facebook page.
When President Uribe said made that speech, when he shared with the nation the cruelty of what was happening with that kid became the face. So what I did was to transfer I'm going to use a lingo of marketing agencies, return of investment, they say, when you transfer that engagement on Facebook to real things. So we had that. We were able to use one message, no more kidnapping. That was the first one. We used 4 slogans. No more kidnapping, no more lies, no more deaths, no more FARC. It was the central message of the red logo, the red part of the logo. And before that, we already knew that 94% of Colombian population, according to polls, rejected decisively FARC, completely rejection. And what I did was to transfer that feeling into a one only message on one page without knowing. Like you don't dream viral, you don't make that plans, you just do it because you feel it. And I was one who had no idea what was going to happen next, even the next day. I just wanted to express.
You were the first movement of this kind, so even the idea of going viral was not part of our vocabulary.
No, because we didn't even know the characteristics of Facebook or the hidden, not yet seen power of the social network until it happened.
So very quickly, walk us through the anatomy. You post your Facebook page. What happens over what period of time?
One X factor happened just right there, the timing and the, how do you say it, when something is really short and concise and sharp. The power of a very short message in the description of the group. So what I did is that I invited my network of friends that were just the seeders. I convinced them, once you have 5 followers, it's easy to get the 10 more, and then 10 more. Bring the first 5. That's the key topic. Bringing the first 5.
You provided that roadmap. You gave instructions for people.
That happened just in the, as you know, you create something on Facebook, and the first thing you do is that you invite people to that initiative. So what happened is that because I did it in the right time when all the news were already talking about this little kid that had been found almost dying, I tapped into the conversation where it hurt the most. It really hurt what I did. It touched the fiber of our hearts. And in just hours, we had massive support. Apparently my friends, the 50 friends or 100 friends that I invited, they were the ones who did it, because they were the ones who brought me the first 1,000. And then those 10,000, like in these Facebook chart maps, that just explode. And you used snowball. You know what word we were using during just first days? Avalanche. Because it was an avalanche of people. And what happened later was finding, excuse me, see my notes, I have them here. We have a route, Facebook, Gmail, Skype. Facebook was the headquarters, was the, it was where we found all the people, not just followers, not people who actually did something. Something you have to understand for any social media cause. You can be happy that maybe you can have followers, right? I don't want to speak bad things about invisible children, but sometimes I feel that it's just online thing and it's not real on the streets on Uganda. So it's not about followers for us. We had, but we wanted doers. You can have as many followers.
In the
first day, we were asking for people doing stuff.
To do what? What did you ask right off the bat? What were you asking?
So what we did is that in the first days, we created like a team that just was conformed out of the blue because of the situation. Many volunteers, they were speaking the same thing, the same language that I was doing. And then they decided to create a movement. So I was on top of the movement, and the first thing we did was to use digital to convey instructions. Okay, print t-shirts, print posters. There are like 50 people that are kidnapped. It's not only Emmanuel. Let's put more faces into this. Let's put more victims. So we found volunteers to create video for us. We had journalists among the Facebook group. People, the members, there were many, many journalists that were offering us spaces. And Facebook actually became the one and only source for everything we got. We only had to ask.
Ari, you getting chatter about what Oscar's saying, and are there things that are resonating with the online community there?
Well, I
think he nailed it in the sense that he was talking about doers, and I think a few of the questions were asking about how do you actually get people to take action, right? So you have a compelling message, you have a really heart sort of tugging at the heartstrings kind of imagery or whatever it is. How do you capitalize on that emotion to get somebody to do something that they may be very scared to do, which is go physically stand someplace and say, I am publicly opposing X or Y?
Or just printing T-shirts. Anybody online?
No, this is a very good question, because it's not just about the activities you do. If you have the creativity to put T-shirts on the streets, that will bring you awareness. But awareness does not translate to doing. You know, to convince people to actually do things for the cause. It was a natural cause that started overnight.
Right.
Patriotism, it takes a lot. And it's something that for example, sorry for you guys, but I don't see that here in America. I don't see any type of patriotism here in the U.S., only when it comes to Afghanistan and things that are outside your country, not for inner things. At least I don't see them yet as we do in very small republics like mine, like Egypt, like Venezuela. For example, Colombia only has 44 million people. Venezuela has only 28. Egypt is like 40-something or 90, right? But it's not like you that have half billion. So it's very easy for us to have a very compact citizenry, and with one national conversation that is led by at least 2 or 3
You're
outlets.
also at a very different place in your national development than the United States is.
I don't want to criticize.
No, it's not a question of no, because I think it's legitimate and it's something interesting to think about, something we might want to think about. We've got lots of political gridlock here. Can social media be mobilized for that? All right, we'll come back, Oscar, with some more. I want to move down to Abderrahim. We talked social media and the impact of social media, but the surveys out in Tahrir Square led, and there was one that is very interesting, of the one survey of the protesters there. 92% of them thought that Al Jazeera was the factor in the protest activities and was driving that. So what was Al Jazeera's role?
Let me, first of all, very quickly say, if you tell any Arab that Egypt is a small country, they'll get upset. If you tell an Egyptian that Egypt is a smaller country, they get very upset. No, I was trying to say compact, more than smaller size, compact. Thanks.
And this is just in the room. You can only imagine, Oscar, what's happening online.
That's right.
I see what you've started.
I mean, Al Jazeera did play a very important role. And to me, the most important role that it played was the bringing about of the marriage between mainstream television, satellite television in this case in the Arab world, and social media such as, in particular, YouTube. But let me just say this very quickly, because the public perception is that this marriage between Al Jazeera and social media started to happen at best in Egypt, those crucial 18 days in Tahrir Square. Right. In fact, the marriage had started to happen long before that. The last parliamentary election that the Egyptians had before the fall of Mubarak, this was November 2010, there was extensive coverage on Al Jazeera showing fraud during that election, using exclusive images that Al Jazeera got from social media. And part of that effort Al Jazeera itself had invested in, providing cameras to activists inside Egypt, going around polling stations and showing what was going on. And so in that sense, that provided a platform from which to consolidate that marriage, so that by the time Tunisia started to happen, there was an infrastructure, there was a unit, a social media unit in the newsroom at headquarters. Al Jazeera had already started to invest in contacts with Tunisians inside Tunisia, providing those pictures. So it's much more the marriage between Al Jazeera and Facebook that helped catapult those events to what they became, rather than just Al Jazeera.
Well, let me just ask you very, very briefly, to either for people who aren't familiar with what you were doing and when you were doing it, or who may not remember exactly how intertwined it was, how you incorporated into your coverage tweets, cell phone videos, social media, Facebook. Just give us a very brief example of how your coverage took shape.
The coverage, I mean, let me talk specifically about those 18 days in Tahrir Square for now. The coverage included all of those, but it was principally YouTube that helped create that marriage between Jazeera and social media. And what happened is, in any normal situation, whether it was in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt, you get this human reaction. People shed courage and other people put on courage. Some of our people who had already been operating there, in Libya, for example, the team under al-Qaddafi, they said, no, this is getting too dangerous for us. We don't want to do it. So they took off the uniform, basically, and dissipated into the population, to use a military imagery. But there were others who were from headquarters willing to take the risk and actually go inside Libya or go inside Tunisia or go inside Egypt and work either to provide those pictures themselves or work with local activists, Egyptians, going around filming what was going on, or willing to put their lives on the line to provide information using Facebook or whatever other social media.
I know one of the big questions that anyone in international media or global media confronts is what filter to use to determine the legitimacy of something, whether you're taking a movement that's a snapshot in a straw, as a famous phrase, as a famous defense secretary once coined some activities of the media, and capturing this very tiny, narrow image, or whether this is an accurate example, whether you're feeding the movement or merely reporting the movement. How did you assess all of that?
Well, as a building block, I have to recall the fact that Al Jazeera's credibility has always been an issue of controversy. A lot of people thought it wasn't credible enough for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of others thought that it was credible. So building on that, the people who were willing to put their lives on the line and get in touch with Al Jazeera and supply those pictures, that became an investment for them.
Did you worry about whether what the stuff you were putting up was driving activities in the streets, was driving the protests, or not?
Well, look, I mean, that's why the notion of the marriage is so important to me here, because remember, the internet in the Arab world is still relatively of limited use. Illiteracy is still a big problem. So the Arab culture has become much more visual. People rely on television. They cannot read or write, but they can watch. So basically the message was driven by television. So if you get Kullina Khaled Said, We're All Khaled Said, on the internet, only a limited audience will see it. But if you put it on Al Jazeera, you're talking about 200 million Arabs who will see it at any given time.
Hari, any comment online about Al Jazeera's role in all of this so far?
Well, I think there was one a while back about from R. Stearns talking about how can primary broadcasters in Lebanon, Egypt, et cetera, best aid this interaction and leverage social media for public good? I mean, it also kind of raises the question of, is this the media's role in it? Should they be active in fostering this conversation, especially in certain countries where the media is a little too close to government?
I mean, Al Jazeera, the Arabic channel at least, has for the last 16 years of its existence functioned along the lines that there are a lot of taboos in the Arab world and that they have to be broken. And one of the taboos is political power, and how do you deal with political power, and how do you speak to political power? So we all, as journalists, find a lot of pleasure in challenging that political power. We haven't been able to challenge every political power in every Arab country.
And the way you challenge,
but that's the mission.
And the way you challenge political power is to engage these voices through these streams. Adel, you've done some research on these movements specifically. You've looked at Tahrir Square and the role of social media in it. You've looked at Tunisia and how that movement developed. What have you found? Put some of the dots together for us here.
Of course, we're in the presence of the experts, the initiators, the mobilizers.
Yeah, but you're the academics.
Yes,
so
of course. So I have to give it.
You're the all-knowing, all-seeing.
I have to speak in highfalutin language. All right. So I think to a large extent, all the themes that have been raised thus far are, speak to some realities on the ground. I think what Oscar said about striking a nerve is really quite critical. Because if you think about it, really all of these different activities, all of these different projects revolve around being able to touch at something that is highly emotive, very genuine, and deeply human, something extremely organic. And this is exactly, you can call it the X factor, you can call it the magnetic moment. There's so many different terms to describe it, but it's practically immeasurable. It is something that cannot be forecasted. Take, for instance, the presidential debates recently with the famous expression, binders full of women by former candidate Romney. The Facebook page, or there were several Facebook pages that came into being immediately afterwards. One of them garnered 150,000 followers within 2 hours. So it's basically an opportunity to identify a critical moment where a juncture could be taken advantage of. Now, that's not to say that these are opportunistic efforts that are meant to basically step in and use public emotionality or public opinion in such a way so as to shift it in a direction, in political directions, but rather there's something very, very visceral about them. And I think the Are Khaled Said situation is interesting and important, and we keep coming back to it, largely because it was functioning or happening at a moment in time when the immediate adversary was the state itself. The state was the institution that had perpetrated the violence, that had institutionalized the violence over at least 60 years or so, and that what was being asked of the public at large by participating both online and offline is practically the impossible. There was a time when to simply like a page, an adversarial page on Facebook in Egypt, was deeply problematic. I remember liking the Mohammed al-Baradei Facebook page, I want to say probably maybe June or July of 2010, and having a cascade or an avalanche of friends and family members tell me, don't do this, it's extremely dangerous, make sure that it's hidden, do it privately. And fast forward a few months, and the Are Khaled Said becomes this mobilizing moment. So I think there's a lot to be said about the capacity of the medium itself in the way that Marshall McLuhan had, and there's something about the message and the content itself.
As I said, you looked into this, and I know, and I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I want to drive one very specific question to you, which is the comparison between what Nadine and Wael were doing in Egypt and you took a hard look at how the Tunisia campaign after the fruit vendor became the catalyst there. So what did you find in comparing the two?
It's important to note that what happened in Tunisia with Mohamed Bouazizi in Sidi Bouzid specifically was street first, then online.
Street first, then
street
online.
Street first, then online.
Verse.
This is Tunisia's situation. So when Mohamed Bouazizi was self-immolated in the street, the first acts of mobilization were in the streets in a marginal city, a small sort of rural city, predominantly rural city, where of course the national media in Tunisia rarely cover, let alone on a global level. So Sidi Bouzid all of a sudden became the epicenter of a national protest movement that slowly made its way out. In the same way that the Syrian protest movement began, also in the rural areas. So in this case, you've got mobilization online, sort of a capacity building. And I think it's important when we try to think of the various sort of means of capacity building. One thing, I'm very fond of analogies and medical analogies for some reason. I think I wanted to be a doctor like most Arabs, and it didn't turn out that way. But it's essentially like post-operative rehabilitation. So it's like teaching your muscles to work again. And that's essentially the way citizenship works within authoritarian systems. Authoritarian systems effectively teach you that silence is the best way. That there are expressions in Arabic that enshrine that. There's an expression in Arabic that says you have to walk next to the wall, be safe, that walls have ears. There's so many expressions in Arabic that enshrine silence and quietness. And of course, there are theories in media called the spiral of silence. So if you think that your opinion is unpopular, then don't share it. But when you realize that your opinion is popular and that you are part of the majority, things change. So that's where Facebook and some of these online campaigns came in. They reminded people that there are others who share their opinions somewhere else. And by mobilizing first online, then the streets using silence so as to not violate laws, the muscles began to work again. You know?
Matt, let me come down to you in the interest of time, and then I want to throw some jump balls to the group before opening the conversation to folks in the room. You are Facebook, right? We're all Facebook. We're all Khaled Said, thanks to the fact that we're all Facebook.
I am not all of Facebook.
What works?
So I think in terms of specific practices in terms of content that work, I think we've seen, the headline is certainly you want to be as engaging as possible, and so that's tapping into things that are happening offline, doing it online so as to mobilize and amplify what's happening offline. I think there are some specific things that people can do, such as using photos, for instance. Obviously, take action-oriented content, so saying, go ahead and like this page or go ahead and meet in this place. That type of thing I think has been really effective. But I think it's also worthwhile to spend at least a minute just talking about the underlying sort of theory of networks and what's going on, I think, in terms of why Facebook can be effective in terms of mobilizing people to act. And there's an enormous amount of research being done now that's absolutely fascinating in behavioral sciences, and I think the things that are happening on social networks are a direct reflection of that research. So I think, for instance, one of the things that's been studied is the idea of revealed preferences, and so people have talked about that on this panel. One of the most important things that was happening in Egypt, I think, was essentially showing other people in Egypt that there are people who did not like Mubarak. And so that the fact that others had similar views to you was something that mobilized people to go out in the streets. And I think we've seen that in a variety of different things, from more mundane things like movie recommendations. If you see that your friend's going to see a movie, you're more likely to go on your own, to a whole variety of different applications now that are emerging in terms of advancing the public good. So there's a company called O-Power, for instance, which created an application that allows people to compare energy usage with their friends. And so you're more likely to conserve energy if you see that your friends are actually using less themselves. So, and then I think within that, if you look at what's going on in behavioral sciences, there are insights from that in terms of the kind of content that you'd want to post. So one fascinating thing that I learned recently is that with anti-drug campaigns, some of the initial campaigns actually would say things like, drug use is a really bad problem, so don't use drugs. And it actually turns out when you learn that drug use is a really bad problem, what that's saying to you is everyone around you is using drugs. So in response to those campaigns, actually drug usage went up or didn't, or like stayed the same. And it's actually much, much more effective. So it's much more effective to say your friends don't use drugs, your friends don't smoke. And when you use messages like that, it actually leads to a decrease in drug use, decrease in smoking. So I think there are these valuable insights from behavioral sciences that can be applied to the kinds of content that people post online.
Adel was talking about a moment ago about, and Oscar mentioned this, sort of the X factor, or what I like to call these magnetic moments where something happens and people are drawn to it. And we've seen these happen throughout history. We didn't need Facebook, frankly, for there to be an American Revolution or a Hungarian uprising or the fall of the wall, for that matter. What creates this magic moment where you've got now citizen networks, as you talked about, Nadine, marrying these magic moments, marrying the kinds of content that we've talked about here to see millions of people in the street? What thoughts do you all have about that? And what lessons can we draw from that? Or is that just too big a question?
I mean, in the specific case of what's been happening in the Arab region over the last couple of years, for me, the most powerful galvanizing factor is, ironically, the evaporation of fear. People just stop being afraid. My sense, and you're Egyptian, so you have to excuse me, my sense is that Egypt would not have happened if the Tunisians had not shed their fear. It may not have happened necessarily. So I think once Egyptians saw that the Tunisians got rid of their fear factor and that there was a good outcome to getting rid of that fear factor by having Ben Ali flee Tunisia, I think it opened the door for others.
Nadine, then Oscar.
You first. No, you first.
I agree. I think I also think that there was a linking the other way. I became the official admin for the Are Khaled Said when they took down the page in November. During the protest in Tunis, they had reached out to the admin, who reached out to me to reach out to Facebook to get the Tunisian pages back up. There was a lot of linkages, and I think that that's what social media allows you to do, or actually including email. The internet itself allows you to link instantly. So I don't have to wait for a reply. I send it, it comes right back, I can act online as if I'm living offline. And Adel had pointed out something saying there was a lot of things that happened on the street, but Egypt also, for me, none of these movements started online. They started actually offline. With Are All Khaled Said, I would not have been engaged. Maybe there's a lot of different things that would have happened had I not been interested in Dr. Baradei and joined that, and then went to meet with him, and then had a conversation, and someone added me to a list. They're all, it's not as if this happens, I start a page, and then I expect it to sort of run off. Another factor is the offline resistance to you engaging or controlling your own life. The reason this thing's, at least for me, the reason this went viral, having worked in communications in the US versus Egypt, they go viral or they pick up speed really quickly because you feel that I don't have another option. And therefore, they're not having a public space and not being able to, for example, call the media without having fear of being arrested. You saw this happen with Are All Khaled Said, but you saw it happen over and over again. The recent death of a lot of the admins of the anti-brotherhood pages is interesting because this is where the space, the battle's being taken. Another Facebook campaign I was involved with is the Askar Kazibun. And everyone remembers that moment. It's the blue bra girl moment that sort of went around the world. It was interesting. We saw the event, we saw the pictures, we went into a meeting with some of the activists, came out saying, Askar Kazibun, this is what the campaign we were doing, started a logo, and actually the front page of one of the major newspapers had Kazibun as its headline. There was no connection, but you tap into that, as we keep saying, you tap into a moment unknowing, it's just there, it just sort of resides, and all of that is really, really important, but it happens offline. I mean, you use online as a tool, but it also happens offline, and we have to continue to engage on the actions that you do offline.
Oscar?
I couldn't agree more, and I want to bring an example that is happening just today. Just give me one moment to explain some news so I can bring you into context. In Venezuela right now, because Chavez is gone, some people are claiming today, it's just in the last 24 hours, that he's dead, clinically dead, that he died in December the 30th in Cuba, and that his cadaver is still in the island, not in Venezuela. So guess what happened? A week ago, a group of students risking their lives. I mean, they are not eating, they are not sleeping, like 50 of them are right now in front of the embassy of Cuba in Caracas. And I'm going to point out the evaporation of fear. But it happened, and there is a pattern. You have found a pattern. We broke the fear, we broke the indifference, it was heavy. But how did we break the fear? By tipping points. 50 students, they showed us the way in Venezuela, is what is happening. And actually, we enjoyed that credibility. When we went to the radio the first times, the first thing they asked was, who are you? No one. There are no leaders. The leaders is the message. But we are students, and we are young professionals, and we are going to make this work one way or another.
Well,
we are tired.
And they are
like
empowered.
It feels like this
empowered.
feeling that is this rage and anger that you just know it's there. I agree with what you said. You just know it's there. You know you are tapping into it. You know it. You sense it. But you want people to go out, not just follow, to go out, and it takes anger. It takes, that rage moment when you decide, yeah, I'm going out.
But we can't be naive about this, Oscar, because just because you sense something's there and because you think you have friends on Facebook or somewhere in the social, you can still show up and get rounded up and thrown in jail and never be heard from.
You need the example. When 50 people are risking their lives, the first thing you do is that if I join them, will I be risking mine too? Yeah, but there are 50 of us, it will be more difficult. So you need like a tipping point, a critic mass of 50 students, of hundreds of people that are risking everything, so the rest will just follow by example.
Hari, questions online? Any got a good one that you want to put to the group?
You know, a couple of them are kind of questioning the media's role in this and wondering what happens. Is Al Jazeera, for example, feeding the revolution or just covering it? And it's, I think, for both Adel and Abderrahim as well.
I think, quite frankly, I think, especially now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's both.
Covering and feeding.
You cannot disentangle the two. Right. Because when you cover, you give people an idea of what's actually going on out there in Tahrir Square. And it's a question of scale. When people see the scale of coverage of what was going on in Egypt, it's easier for things to pick up from there. So yeah, Al Jazeera did help televise the revolution, but directly or indirectly did also help make the revolution.
Adel, while you answer, let me just mention to the audience in the room, you see 2 microphones on either side. Let's open it up to your questions now, and let me invite you to move to those microphones, and we'll start turning to your questions in just a moment. Oh, we have runners. I'm sorry. The mics will come to you. They're just resting in the stands. Go ahead, Adel.
I think the question of what role Al Jazeera played and how to situate this is really quite important, because we have to look at these experiments and these moments and these instruments and institutions not in a vacuum, and definitely not at a particular moment in time. The Al Jazeera of November 2010 that Abderrahim is describing, or the Al Jazeera of the 18 days of the revolution in Egypt, and now are very, very different institutions with different coverage, with different audiences, with different trends and different inclinations. In the same way that the page, Are Khaled Said, during its early days of capacity building, and during those, even on a day-by-day basis, the popularity and the appeal would sometimes spike, and there would be tremendous troughs. And today, of course, it has an iconic power, but may not have the ability to mobilize in the manner that it did before, even though it has triple the amount of followers that it did then. So I think it's critical to keep in mind that movements have shelf life, and this shelf life has a lot to do with precedent. And the power and the beauty and the remarkable aspect of the Are All Khaled Said movement is that it was, a convergence of different categories and variables and factors that created this cataclysm that turned into an eruption.
Why haven't we seen
not be repeatable?
Well, why haven't we seen something repeatable out of Syria, for example?
Well, I mean, I think this is where, thank you for asking this question. Part of the reason why this hasn't happened in Syria is because nowadays the state has the ability to avoid the monopolization of victimhood on the part of civilians. So now the state can pose as a victim and target opposition groups and opposition figures and say that they're the ones perpetrating the violence, they're the ones responsible for the destabilization, and it works, and it's working in Egypt as well.
Matt, do you have thoughts about why Facebook and Syria haven't somehow galvanized in the way we...
No, I don't have specific thoughts. I mean, I think one thing that you sort of take for granted as you watch people on this panel talk about the amazing work they've done is that anybody can do it, and I think that's certainly true, but it's also extraordinary people doing extraordinary work at extraordinary times, and it's not necessarily evident to me that would happen in every single place.
Can't take it for granted. And the content matters. The getting loud does marry with the getting creative, having the bumper stickers
But I'd like to say that it's also government, and part of it is an ignorance on the government side on the power of these kind of things. In authoritarian regimes, they believe that they have complete control over the media apparatus. And therefore, I remember during the early days when the government did not understand what was happening, and it took them about 4 or 5 weeks to start reacting to the protests, because they didn't understand the June protests, the silent flash mobs that were happening. They didn't know how to engage with it. They didn't even know where it was coming from. So for them to even understand that this is happening on Facebook, and this is and the U.S. government as well, when the 18 days happened, the question was, why didn't we know this was coming? Well, the Egyptian revolution, or the start, January 25th, was by invitation. When Tunis fell, at that time, the admins of two of the admins of the Are All Khaled Said decided, why didn't we do this? Let's put out an invite and see what happens. And so it's sort of throw a card in the wind on our side. Let's try anything because there's nothing else. But on the other side is that there isn't a counter force online. And so with Egypt in particular, now there is a counter force. You have the opposition and the Ikhwan who are both very strong online. And you also have the state apparatus becoming more and more tactically involved online.
Very, very good point. Quickly?
Yeah, very quickly. One fundamental, there are some fundamental things that Tunisia and Syria have in common, but there are also some fundamental differences. Both Tunisia under Ben Ali was a police state in the same way that Syria is. Ben Ali, ironically, had invested tremendous treasure in hooking up Tunisia, which is not the case of Syria. But then you also have the role of the military. It's not just a question of information. These are two different militaries. Ben Ali relied more on a police force which didn't work. And suddenly the army said, for whatever reason, we're not going to shoot at civilians. That didn't happen with Bashar al-Assad. He'd always relied on the support and loyalty of the army, and that continues today to a large extent.
Okay, let me move to the room for some questions. Hand up, and let's start down with this gentleman in the middle, and we'll pass the mic to you. If I could ask you to identify yourself, tell us where you're from, keep your question as brief as possible, answers as brief as possible, we'll get in as many as possible.
Thank you, and thanks for being here today. It's a very interesting conversation. My name is Tyler Brown from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in our Diversity Innovation Department. My question for you is the processes that you've seen work in the Arab world and in Latin America, building these social movements through online platforms, how do you see those applying in the United States? Is it possible to galvanize that same sentiment in the United States? Is it possible to organize people in the same way, thinking about the Occupy movements and so forth, where there was people in, but also a large group that was clearly out, and those movements have seemed to have died down? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Who would like to address that?
I'll be happy to start. You know, this is my own little theory, obviously, but in the specific case of Egypt, I think part of the reason why it was successful is that the protests were targeted at a specific thing, which is the regime, and more specifically, Hosni Mubarak. In the case of Colombia, for example, you're able to mobilize all these people, but there isn't a particular figurehead, for example, that you're targeting with those protests. Similarly, here in the United States, when the Occupy Wall Street movement started, in parallel, by the way, with what was going on in Egypt, if you all remember the protests in Wisconsin, they all said, you know, there were banners saying, basically echoing what was happening in Tahrir Square. But they didn't have, Occupy Wall Street didn't have the kind of specific focus on something tangible that they wanted to change or get rid of in the way that the Egyptians did. That's my little theory.
I have a comment. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Adel.
You can go ahead. Oh, sorry. No. First. Okay. I think it probably has a lot to do with consensus building. In an environment where you've got an authoritarian regime, as Abderrahim said, it's easy to identify, an entity, an institution, a figurehead that you could basically, where all of your animosity can gravitate towards. Here in the United States, it's extremely easy for every movement to break consensus and turn into a partisan battle.
Which is what happened in Egypt after Mubarak fell.
Yes, exactly. Which is part of the reason why what happened with Are All Khaled Said will likely never happen again in Egypt, because it will always fall into a political spectrum where various competing parties can utilize the exact same notions of victimization. Whereas here in the United States, it would be very difficult. I think even the most critical issues, let's say the gun laws, or things that affect large communities in the United States, even then there isn't consensus on these. So in the absence of genuine consensus on any ground, on any foundational issues, it's very difficult to mobilize and expect that there will become sort of a pan-national movement in the US. But nevertheless, there is a component here that is quite critical and quite useful, which is the presence of a free media that can literally cover any incident, irrespective of where it happens and irrespective of the kind of language used in that movement.
Matt, have you seen anything that comes close in the United States? not going to
certainly. I mean, I think a wide range of things from the presence of social media in elections, for instance. I think the relationship between candidates and elected officials now and constituents is dramatically different than it may have been 5 years ago. I mean, I guess my pushback on the question is that I think there's something much more fundamental going on here than just about particular places. I think what's going on is what you're seeing is the power of a more connected world. I think when I came into Facebook, I learned very early on that our mission was to make the world more open and connected. And I didn't really understand what that meant. I thought it seemed like it was half of a clause and there was something else that was supposed to follow. Make the world more open and connected for what? And I think actually what you've seen in the course of the 2 years since I've been at the company is that connection itself really actually matters. And it's not something that's just an activist tool. It's not something that's just about Egypt. It's not something that's just about Colombia. It's a tool that governments can use to be more connected to citizens. It's a tool that you can use for disaster relief. It's a tool that you can use for lots and lots of different purposes. I think we're at the forefront of seeing how social media can be used for public value.
Something else too, and Harry, let me come over to you, and then we'll come back to you. And that is the notion of stakes. What is at stake? Well, what is the price of entry?
I actually want to take it back. It's also you need to be able to understand what is a win. While Khaled Said for everyone seems to be a win, to me, no. The campaign that I really feel won was the Askar Kazibun campaign. You know why? Because we got people to create community networks. They went out over 800 screenings all over the country in some of the rural areas, which Khaled Said could not reach out to. So yes, getting 1 million people into the street, Khaled Said did not do that. It connected the people who got the 1 million people into the streets. So we need to decide and know our audience and know what is possible and be able to achieve that. Getting that in the US, 1 million people into the street is not what you're looking for.
I want to be sure we get more voices into the conversation. So Hari from online and then back to the audience.
Real quick, on a slightly lighter note, Nadine, your pants are rocking the internet, and Matthew, so are your shoes. Matthew, the question that I also wanted to ask is Facebook going to try to create any sort of new tools for organizing social movements? Do they encourage the use of the tool for protests? And then also, how does your real name policy possibly dissuade activists?
I thought you were on a lighter note.
Yeah, well, I wanted to soften it up and then kind of follow up.
Yeah, so we don't create tools for specific communities. We don't create tools for musicians. We don't create tools that are exclusively for governments. We don't exclusively create tools for activists, but we're constantly innovating, sometimes to the disappointment of our users, to try to figure out new ways to achieve our mission of making the world more open and connected. And so obviously we'll be continuing to do that. I do think it's really interesting that I think there's been kind of an underdevelopment of the use of social media to create public value. So the comparison that I tend to point to is if you look at Spotify, for instance. So Spotify, I don't know how many people in the audience are familiar with Spotify, but Spotify is a music sharing tool. So it allows you basically to listen to music that you own. It allows you to listen to music that is available on Spotify that you don't own. And then it also creates a story in your news feed when you are listening to a song that tells other people what you're listening to. And so when Spotify was introduced into the United States in July, and it announced Facebook integration in September. And then in January, there was a magazine article with the CEO of Spotify on the cover of the magazine. The headline was, "The Most Important Man in Music." So July, introduced to the United States. September, Facebook integration. January, the most important man in music. I think the question for the audience, the question for people who think about how to create public value is, what's the Spotify of conflict mitigation? What's the Spotify of water access? What's the Spotify of educational access? I think we have examples that point in the direction that there's going to be tremendous value in these areas, but we don't yet have things that show the real possibility. So just one more second. One of the most amazing revolutionary things that's going on in education is the development of MOOCs, massively open online courseware, which is basically institutions like, or companies like edX, Coursera, Udacity, which are creating enormous amounts of free educational material. So MIT lectures and engineering classes that are available for free globally. So they've got this amazing amount of material, but the question is, how are they going to distribute it? And so I think there are opportunities for Facebook integration where you're taking a platform of 1 billion people, you're layering that distribution mechanism on top of an enormous amount of valuable content, and all of a sudden you're transforming the kind of educational access that a 16-year-old in India, in rural India, has. I think we're just at the forefront of starting to see that.
It's going to be a game changer. I want to certainly reinforce that people in higher education are really looking forward to free content. So let's go back to the audience for a question here. I saw some other hands up in the back.
Hi there, Graham Lampa from the State Department. I work very closely with the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor that are working on internet freedom activities. And Hari had asked my question to the Facebook rep, Matt, about your real name policy. Didn't hear an answer on that because it's very problematic when you also have Facebook graph search now where, for instance, the FARC could do a search that says, tell me all the people who like the Facebook fan page who have maybe over 1,000 fans and have their home address listed.
It's not funny.
Right. So if you could address that, because obviously, and why you have your real names policy, because is it advertising model? How does that work?
It's not fundamentally an advertising model. The two great questions there. It's not fundamentally an advertising model. It's a philosophy of what a social network should be. So it's about your real identity. It's about knowing that the person that you're connecting to is actually a real person and you know who that person is. I mean, I think if you look at the shift of identity online, it used to be that your email address would be, mp2075@aol.com. Now it's Matthew Perault. And people, I think, are becoming increasingly comfortable because there's a lot of value to be gained in using your real identity. I also think I always think it's sort of a curious thing because, first of all, I don't think there's any evidence that using a pseudonym online actually protects you. I think if you look at the most famous human rights and internet case of all time, the Xitao case in China, that occurred at a time, he was using a Yahoo email address. It occurred at a time when people weren't using their real identity online. It didn't protect him. And I also think it really helps, and this actually is a segue to your question about graph search. I think the thing about using your real identity is it gives you a better approximation of the real risk that you're taking online. So if you think that by using a pseudonym you're going to be safe, you're wrong. People can identify you from your IP address, for instance. But if you see that you're using your real name, and this is evidenced in comment sections, for instance, where comment sections of websites where people use their real name and the quality of the discourse is elevated, when you're using your real name online, you're more likely to understand the kinds of risks, and you're more likely to engage, I would say, in responsible behavior. So if you look at the people on this panel, and this is not activity that I engaged in, but if you look at the people on this panel, they took significant risks. And I think when you see your real name, it's more likely that you can, when you are using your real name, it's more likely that you are, sorry.
Oscar needs to jump in or he's going to jump out of his skin here.
Yes, I want to tap into this privacy thing because it works pro, it works cons. It has pros and it has cons. Let's take the case of what I lived in Colombia when the first interviewers were asking, oh, who are you? You're students, you're young professionals, and why are you showing your real faces? Don't you think it's extremely dangerous? Then it comes the evaporation of fear. So actually media were following us just for the fact that there were faces, that there were people they could relate to. Actually, when I offered my first interviews on television explaining the whole thing, the first supports came from my moms, women, because they couldn't believe that a 30-year-old guy was willing to, risk everything he had. So by solidarity, my mom was, in risk, so all the moms.
Yeah, but by definition.
And many.
But you were a leader in this, and being the leader is different than being the follower, and the followers need that anonymity.
People appreciated that, like me, many other students were fearless to show their real names.
But others aren't fearless. I mean, some of these movements are propelled by
it's
people.
It's a different question now, how you convince people to break the fear, but just the fact that we were showing our faces, it brought a lot of support, as opposed to if we were using masks.
But the Colonel Khaled Said, one of the things about this, the page itself was its anonymity and creating a pseudo-identity. And what happened November when I reached out to Facebook was there was an attack, and because of the anonymous nature of the admins, we were all anonymous at this point, they shut down the page, and I had to use my real name. Now, that was sort of a spur of the moment, oh my God, there was a huge protest the next day, you have to put someone, okay, use my name, here's my password, and this is how we got around it. It is a real problem for us, for going in and out of the country and other admins to be able to use their real name. Yes, there is an issue, but we did a workaround.
Where were you when you used your real name?
I was in D.C. And so, yeah, but that gave me this was why I could use my real name. They couldn't, the fear that they had engaging in something like this would have diminished their ability, whether for their own families. I mean, it's not about risking just yourself. It's about risking your families and everything like that. And so, yes, while it could be interesting to get people out there, but the face of the movement wasn't an individual, wasn't a leader. It was the dead, the martyrs, and this is what you see over and over again.
Quickly, and then we're almost out of time. I see one more hand, but
I just wanted to throw something in here. I mean, we keep talking about the leaderlessness of the revolution, and I'm not going to challenge this, but I just want to say that the individuals who are behind this are personalities. They have charisma. They have interesting things that they can contribute. Wael Ghunaim, even though he was totally unknown to the majority, to the 400,000 people who were following him, or following his posts on the page, was able to galvanize support because of his rhetoric, because of his language. He was. I mean, in some ways, and they're not replaceable. If Wael Ghunaim's identity had been identified early on and he was targeted, it would have been very difficult to replace him.
He was targeted. He was arrested.
He was targeted. He was arrested eventually.
Okay, very quickly, because I've got to hand it back over to Sheldon. We're going to take a break.
I'd like to go back to, Frank, something that you started to touch on, which is what's at stake. I know very little about this space, but in the development world, I think that there are organizations that could do a lot more good, but are quite fearful of not having control of the message, and maybe backlash against the organization. So
Adele, you want to take that up for a second?
Can you kindly repeat the question again? Would you want to speak?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, a lot of people think about the risks of action. People don't think about the risks of inaction. So I think social media and the work that many of the people in this room do is going to be something that's it's here to stay. And so I think the question is, how can you learn to be a good digital citizen and take advantage of the opportunities and mitigate some of the risks?
Hari, you've been tracking both the comments and the questions from our online participants. Your concluding thoughts, their concluding thoughts through you?
I mean, I think that it's, most of the folks that have been following are trying to figure out how to use your best practices in their own campaigns, whether it's to change the world or whether it's something much more local. So it's really kind of been amplifying and thinking about little koans of wisdom that you've dropped that they could actually use today or tomorrow. And so it's interesting that, while the conversation on stage is very global, I think online it's become very local and people trying to connect it to their immediate lives.
Here's what I've heard. I've heard about compelling messages at compelling moments with an X factor. I've heard about leaderless revolutions that nonetheless have leaders because someone has to launch that Facebook. Right. Someone has to get out there and be willing to take the risks to encourage others. I've heard about this very interesting cycle for all the conversation about social media. Mainstream media or traditional media are still needed to elevate, to propel, to drive this kind of thing. I've heard about this remarkable experience when people do go out into the streets about how the Facebook presence drives, the physical presence drives the online presence. So there is not a formula here necessarily, but there are certainly patterns. Right. One of which is this idea of these clear, simple calls to action, things that match the message to the moment, to the catalyst, to the content. And that, you can't put it in a bottle. Right. You're not necessarily going to be able to predict when it happens. I think this notion of anonymity versus being very public is something that that movements across the world have to grapple with all the time, because the stakes, the consequences, the risks are very different one place to the next. Certainly in the United States, a very different situation than Tunisia or Venezuela or Colombia, where there are different kinds of risks involved, very fundamentally different risks. Thanks very much to the panel. Sheldon, over to you.
Yeah, and Frank, we heard one more thing from Hari there at the end, which is a strong desire among our thousands of people who are online and to know more about best practices, and that's exactly where we're going to be going with our next panel. So take a 10 to 15, actually, we're going to take a break and be back in here at, it's almost 11 o'clock. We really are going to ask you to get back in here by 11:10 so we can start up with Clay Shirky's keynote address right away. So we will be starting very quickly. Thank you very much. Thanks to this panel again. It was just an incredible start of the day.